platforms. This is David Tulis, and we have on the phone Hannah Cox from the Beacon Center in Nashville, which has had major success against an ordinance there that amounted to an outright ban. So, Hannah, what were the peculiarities of the ordinance in Nashville, and what has happened with the judge's review of the ordinance?
Oh, of course. Thanks, David, for having me on. Happy to talk to you this morning. We had a similar ordinance in Nashville that was passed a couple of years ago by our Metro Council, and it's one of many that started cropping up across the state and even across the country of this nature. The Nashville ban had a couple unique provisions, I think several of which Chattanooga's share. But initially, their regulations consisted of a 3% cap on non-owner occupied short-term property rentals. It consisted of a ban on advertising the short-term rental property in any way, so you couldn't even put a sticker in your window or a small sign on your property to indicate that it was available to rent on Airbnb or HomeAway. And lastly, there was a stipulation that said authorities were able to go through someone's records without obtaining a warrant. So there were obviously several constitutional issues with their initial regulations, which we at the Beacon Center decided to challenge in a litigation case.
Was that in Chancery Court in Davidson County or in City Court?
This was in City.
And is that where the case is now, or has it been appealed?
The case has actually has been ruled upon by a judge early on in the case. The last two provisions that I mentioned, the ones that prevented someone from being able to advertise the property and the one that allowed authorities to search records without a warrant, those were both overturned very quickly. The not being able to advertise your property was an obvious violation of First Amendment rights, and authorities being able to go through your records without a warrant, an obvious violation of the Fourth Amendment. So those were overturned outright. The third provision that we challenged, which was the 3% cap on non-owner occupied, also known as Type 2 short-term property rentals, took a little bit longer to decide. We challenged that on a couple of different constitutional issues. One of which was that we believed it effectively created a monopoly. If you're telling someone that their neighbors, 3% of their neighbors, can do something but they can't, that creates a monopoly on someone's ability to rent out Airbnbs in a neighborhood. It also is unequal protection of the law. If you're telling 3% of people they can do something but the rest of people can't, that's not constitutional. And thirdly, we thought the law was unconstitutionally vague. There is a law that says laws must be able to be understood by someone of average intelligence, and they must be clear and concisely written. And the way this regulation was written was done in such a way that we thought it made it very complicated for someone to be able to ascertain whether or not they were within the constraints of the law. And that last challenge is what we actually were ruled in favor on by a judge. And so because we won on that ground, it did open the door for the Nashville Metro Council to basically come in and rewrite their law. And so they are in the process of doing that. I think there's been several other bills introduced, but nothing has passed yet.
We have no challenge yet to the ordinance in Chattanooga, though there's one homeowner, I believe, not in the city limits, but on Lookout Mountain, who promises a challenge to that town's ordinance. I'm not sure where that ordinance is in production, but promises a challenge there. Hannah Cox of Beacon Center, the Chattanooga ordinance says that there is a district in which if you live, you may be made to participate in the sharing economy through Airbnb and like platforms, and if you're not in the district, you cannot, which poses the very awkward dilemma of let's say a street. On one side of the street is my listener, who is allowed to do Airbnb, and the man across the street, the family across the street, just 150 feet away, cannot, because that party is not in the district and has no means of appeal, no means of petitioning for rezoning, which is the current process. You petition for rezoning to be legal in that field. Right. Under the new ordinance, that's not going to be possible. So that's an arbitrary and capricious distinction made between two like parties with similar legal standing. So that violates an important rule of law here.
And unfortunately, this is the type of regulation we're going to approach across our state, and it's not a wise way to approach regulating these types of businesses. If someone wants to use their property and they want to, rent out a room to someone, if they want to rent out their whole house to someone, that's not something that should affect other people. It's not something the government should be telling some people they can do and some people they can't. then do you have to have a permit to rent out a room in your home to your child who's home from college? To what extent is taken? There's much more sensible ways of regulating these sort of things and ensuring that someone who is using their property as a short-term property is not violating someone else's property rights. And we already have these laws in place. These have already been in place for a long time. It's already against the law to be very loud in your home, to throw loud parties, to have noise violations in the neighborhood. It's already against the law to have trash alongside your property and to not keep your property up to basic standards. These are already things that, you frequently hear people complain about when they are on the opposite side of this issue, when they don't want Airbnbs or HomeAway or VRBO in their neighborhood. These are types of things that could happen if someone's renting their home out for short terms and that violate their property rights. But those are already things that they could call and complain about, that the police would show up for, that the person would see violations for. And these kind of regulations, with that in mind, we see governments consistently violating constitutional rights. The one exception to that is Memphis, who actually got it right. They came in and said, we're going to make sure we enforce our existing laws. I believe if you have a number of complaints, you can lose your permit. And those are sensible things to do to make sure that these things don't get out of control and to make sure that everyone's rights are protected without violating anyone's constitutional rights. I don't.
This is David Tulis. We're talking with Hannah Cox at Beacon Center. And Hannah, let me just press the point a little bit about Memphis. Memphis has a particular part of its code that discusses Airbnb. So again, what are the requirements to be an Airbnb family in Memphis? What's the whole picture in a nutshell?
I don't know. I don't want to give anybody specific advice, but I'm fairly sure there aren't any really requirements. I think that you can go on and register your home as a short-term rental property, and from that point on, I think you just proceed as normal. I don't think they've really done a whole lot more, and they haven't had a whole lot of issues either. And what's interesting is, as we dug into our case in Nashville, when we really started filing Freedom of Information Acts and looking into how many complaints have been filed, the amount of complaints that had actually been filed against short-term rental properties in Nashville was negligible. And there was a handful of properties that had received numerous violations of noise or trash or that sort of complaint. And it just seems very simple. Instead of going after the bad actors, they try to punish everyone. Well, they should just enforce the laws that are already on the books and go after the bad actors. And if someone proves that they aren't managing their business properly, then take away their permit, tell them they don't have the ability to anymore at the point. But arbitrarily banning some access this kind of use of their property doesn't make sense.
If my listener, Hannah Cox at Beacon Center, wants to get into Airbnb, is he more motivated or less motivated to improve his property and to maintain it in pristine condition with fine protections for neighbors?
Yeah, I think the answer is somewhat obvious. Daily, who contact us and say, due to my Airbnb business, I've been able to improve my home, and I take a lot of pride in it. I've been able to fix it up, and I've been able to add on these additions. And people who operate Airbnbs, this is a lot of times livelihood.
Hannah, you're breaking up. Hannah, listen.
Hello.
This is David Tulis. We're talking with Hannah Cox, and I'm asking her to call me back because she has a bad connection. The question that we have here in Chattanooga about the ban on Airbnb is it's unfortunate. It's the unfortunate. Hey Hannah, the unfortunate arbitrary nature of it, and the fact that to have a ban of any kind on the sharing economy is like Beijing raising a digital wall around the internet and saying, well, the internet can only have these types of interactions and no interaction at all where someone is trying to rent out a home at a platform such as Airbnb. So you're saying Hannah Cox about how being in the sharing economy tends to improve the appearance and the use of a house and land around it.
Absolutely. As I was saying, the people that we speak with have consistently spoken to this business being able to provide for them to add on to their home or to improve their home or to increase their quality of life. and they take pride in their businesses. You know, a lot of them will mention their ratings on Airbnb. A lot of them have super host ratings, which means that you are an exemplary host, that you get top feedback from your visitors, and they take a lot of pride in it. And also, a lot of these people, they actually live in the homes they're renting out. They know their neighbors. They don't want their neighbors upset with them. They have good relationships with them. A lot of them have had neighbors sign on to letters for them saying that they should be able to do this and in support of them. As I said before, if you look at the actual complaints filed, it's a very small handful of bad actors that are giving the whole industry a bad name. And what should be the focus is shutting down those bad actors and dealing with them with existing laws and regulations and allowing the rest of the people to use their property as they choose.
So you're saying Beacon Center would, in general, favor a non-regulatory approach. In other words, Chattanooga should not have any ordinance at all about Airbnb, but simply ignore it because it is a self-regulating private mechanism where all the actors, both the visitors and the homeowners, have every interest in getting high marks from the other party.
Sure. Well, and we would say that, you know, there are already existing regulations on the books that are appropriate for dealing with this. So there's no need to create new regulations. We just need to enforce the laws that we already have. Well,
our analysis of the Chattanooga Airbnb ordinance, Hannah Cox, is that it's simply another variation of zoning. It is a way of trying to justify and defend the existing zoning structure. What does your liberty-oriented organization say about zoning in general? Is it in favor of zoning, or is there a fundamental problem philosophically and morally with it?
Sure. We have not actually taken an actual stance on zoning one way or another. I do think our main agenda is addressing people's property rights and making sure that they are allowed to use their property as long as they are not infringing on someone else's rights. And so we see a number of issues. You know, of any local area that you look into, there's always property right infringements, and some of those are tied into zoning, some are not. I don't think I would be quick to point the finger at zoning in particular being a bad thing. It's more so how people are regulating, how local governments are regulating property and making sure that people have the full extent of the use of their property. So in a couple other instances, we've already seen property rights being violated in Nashville in a couple of other ways. So for one, recently I found out that you can't have a home business in Nashville. So technically, a grandmother cannot give piano lessons out of her home in Nashville due to this ban on home business.
So that's, again,
regulation.
That's the vagueness problem, Hannah.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the idea of people who want to regulate other people often forget an important part of the structure of the American system of government, which is three parts. One part is the judiciary, and in every city there's a judiciary. There's a county court, there's a city court for municipal ordinance disputes, and the people who want regulations say, well, we have got to prevent things from happening ahead of time by making a rule. But if there's a real wrong, if there's a real actionable tort, then the court is open, and someone to file a suit against a neighbor over the use, let's say, of an Airbnb house, there has to be a demonstrable wrong or injury that's shown, and so the court's open. And so it seems that we should say let people have real disputes that can be measured and can be weighed and looked at by a jury. Let them have their own disputes handled in the court, and let us leave the marketplace free from our well-intentioned meddling and our well-intentioned organizing and militarizing, if you will, of the housing sector and the use of housing sector.
Sure, and I think you're right, and I think that, you know, just to point out again that it has to be a pretty big violation, I think, for someone to take their neighbor to court. But for smaller infractions and things that are burdensome or nuisome in your everyday life, there are already regulations to prevent those things even from happening. If my neighbor is downstairs blasting loud music, as I actually have a neighbor who frequently does, I can call the police. I can file a noise complaint. If I do that 2 or 3 times, they're probably going to be cited. If I do it more, my apartment's probably going to kick them out.
Well,
there are already resources in place for dealing with the majority of the issues that when we did see the complaints that were filed in a few number of Airbnbs that were out there, they had to do with small things such as noise violations, such as trash. I mean, they were really very negligible kind of complaints that we already have an adequate system for dealing with. So I just think that we need to remember that the market can handle a lot of this. and does. It is largely self-regulating. And for the bad actors that are out there, there is already recourse that can be taken. There's no need to start limiting the authority for the actions of a few small bad actors.
We do thank you for joining us. This is David Tulis. We're talking with Hannah Cox of Beacon Center now here in Chattanooga today and tomorrow. Hannah, we've got the Homeschool Expo is going till 6 o'clock today and through 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And there are 70 vendors, many talks, many lectures, experts of all kinds in the homeschooling sector. Has Governor Haslam signed a bill that creates a sort of a health savings account for educational needs? What's happened in the legislature? I've missed that story. Fill me in, please.
He has, David. We actually advocated on behalf of a bill. This was last session in 2016. It's called the IEA program. That stands for the Individualized Education Account Program. And this is something that was passed, and it effectively creates a system where families who have a child with special needs who are in the public school system and who feel like they aren't having their needs met and want to look at other educational paths for their child have access to this education savings account, which functions basically like a health savings account. It for a child who's approved into the program, a portion of the money that the state already spends on their education goes into that fund, and the parent then has discretion to use that money towards a variety of different educational needs for their child. So that could be tuition at a private school, that could be homeschooling supplies, that could be supplemental costs for tutoring, additional therapies they might need. It's a limited bill that we passed. It only applies to children with an IEP in the public school system right now, but we are working consistently to expand this to other families. So for families who are interested in homeschooling or who are looking for other paths for their child's educational needs, this is a really good first step that we're really proud to have been a part of.
Well, Hannah, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it very much. Again, the website for Hannah Cox's Beacon Center in Nashville is beacontn.org. That's BEACON, beacontn.org. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
David Tulis, we were talking with Hannah Cox about Airbnb and efforts to restrict and restrain the sharing economy. The sharing economy, of course, brought to you by the intergalactic internet and the way people can meet for highly specialized, highly technical exchanges. They're using credit cards and platforms where vendors and buyers get together. In Chattanooga, there's a Beijing wall that the city council in June raised around Chattanooga. Now, this is a wall to keep out a certain kind of traffic. And the enforcement of this wall is, get this. The enforcement of this wall and making sure all the doors are locked shut is the Economic Development Office of Mayor Andy Burke. Mayor Andy Burke has an economic development office that denies and flies in the face of the very popular theory of Chattanooga, and that is that Chattanooga is the gig city. But Mayor Burke doesn't believe that, and neither does the city council. There is not a gig city. We have to have firewalls to keep out Airbnb traffic from large parts of Chattanooga, and that is because the city council, with Demetrius Coonrod saying no, right? Demetrius Coonrod, the new councilwoman, said no. The only no vote was by Demetrius Coonrod, whereas Ken Smith and the other conservatives all said yes, we want to have a Beijing wall around Chattanooga, and we want to stifle and keep out and deny and forbid the sharing economy in this $2 million a year and growing sector, and that is the short-term vacation rental sector, where people become members of Airbnb. They apply to become members of this very progressive company, and then they can have people from Qatar, from Belgium, from South Africa, from Minnesota, from Quebec to come here and stay not in a public hotel or motel in Commerce, but privately in their homes or their apartments and their houses. And this is simply a disastrous ordinance. And the people whom I spoke to about it, who favored it, were just simply just not informed. And what they need to do, these people, is to tune in here at the David Tulis Show every day at 9 o'clock. I thank you, my listener, for giving me just a few minutes at a time. I just need a few minutes every day so I can suggest ways in which you can love your neighbor and buy local David Tulis, brought to you by Nooganomics.com. Nooganomics.com, the website for the man who matters. Right here, David Tulis.
Nooga Radio, AM 1240, 92.7 FM.